let's go over again. Forget the red line now. Let's restart here. Initially, our budget line makes us achieve U1. But now, with the increase in P1, budget line shrink, the budget set shrinks, right? And now we may achieve to only U2. So the new utility, U2, is lower than the original one, so that the difference would be negative. That's why we say the consumer is harmed by the increase in price, right? But it's not easy to measure U1 and U2, so we need to find another way to measure utility. How may we do this? We'd like to measure the utility, but we don't know the exact value of utility. However, we may do something like this. With the same MRT, you will see the minimum expenditure. If we wanted to achieve this utility level, the minimum expenditure would be this, right? With the same MRT, if we want this level of utility, the minimum expenditure reduced, and then reduced to here, right? So as the utility level goes up, the minimum expenditure increases. Okay? So the minimum expenditure P1, P2, and U actually is a monetary way to measure utility, because as U goes up, your expenditure must goes up. Your minimum expenditure must goes up. Is that right? So once again, minimum expenditure is another way, a monetary way to measure utility. What do you think? Okay? Now, so we may measure delta U using E. Alright? So how to measure delta U using E? The new one. What is the new one? Now P1 star, P2, and the new utility would be U2 minus the original utility P1, P2, U1. The new utility, the old utility, the original utility, okay? Once again, we wanna measure utility or the level of the indifference curves. So we use the expenditure function to do that. But if we want to compare them, we actually need to fix the relative price. So here, we use the expenditure function to measure utility. However, you will see the price changes as U changes. So we need to do something. We say, can we just transform this into something using P1, P2? Excuse me, for what? Once again, excuse me for a while. All right. No. sorry. Let me re-explain. Okay, right. We want to measure the difference in U1 and U2. So we need to decide at first whether use the initial MRT or the new MRT. If we use this one, then we need to compare this expenditure and this expenditure, right? So that we may measure U1 and U2. Or we may measure U1 and U2 using this. Okay? So let's try this one, the new environment of price. So U2, U1. The U1 part corresponds to this minimum expenditure, and we need to fix P1 star P2. So we may change this to, now U2 should be measured by P1 star P2 and U2 minus this. It would be expenditure P1 star P2 U1. With the same MRT, so that we use the monetary way to measure the difference between U2 and U1. Alright? When U1 is higher than U2, then the minimum expenditure for this must be higher than the minimum expenditure for this. Okay? Is that clear? Once again. Alright, now the MRTs look like this. If you want to achieve a higher utility level, your minimum expenditure must be higher. Okay? If you want to achieve to a lower utility level, the minimum expenditure would be lower. Okay? But we need to fix the MRT so that we may compare the vertical difference. And you will say, oh, the vertical difference is Q2 prime and Q2. However, P2 doesn't change at all. So the corresponding minimum expenditure would be P2 Q2 prime and P2 Q2. Okay? That verifies what? The expenditure for this is higher than the expenditure for this. Because if you want to buy a higher quantity, you have to pay more. And this times P2 corresponds to this expenditure, right? And so vertically is Q2 prime minus Q2. But for expenditure, we need to multiply P2 so that it convert to expenditure. So don't forget what we wanted to measure. U2 minus U1. So U2 minus U1, but we use the expenditure, the minimum expenditure to achieve U2, the minimum expenditure to achieve U1 with the same slope. And you see the difference of this one with this. It's because we change this into P1, P2, U1 minus P1 star, P2, U1. Right? Do you think this would be equivalent to this one? Yes or no? So what does the yellow part mean? The yellow part, a new price, right? P1 star, P2, U2. And the white part, P1, P2, U1. Do you think these two are equivalent to each other? They correspond to the same Q2, right? So this one would be P2Q2 and P2Q2. The change from here to here is due to the change of P1. But Y and P2 remain the same, right? So we have the same Y, which is the expenditure, right? Okay? So they are the same. And now you see the result here. So the logic U1 is actually the U bar. The logic here is actually should go back to this one. It's more clearer. But it's clearer than more. Clearer is a comparative. All right. So we use this as the measure. And the logic behind this is because when we fix the MRT we choose to be P1 star P2, okay? So a higher U must correspond to a higher expenditure. A lower U corresponds to a lower expenditure. So we use the expenditure function as a measure of the utility. Otherwise, we don't know what does U2 mean and U1. We don't know the precise value of U1 and U2. However, we may measure them using the expenditure function. Okay? So this is one way to measure the utility function. And the other way, we actually may use P1, P2, U1. U2, sorry. P1, P2, U1. We have two ways to measure the difference in utility. Oh, I forgot something. I was too busy during the break. I forgot something. All right. Once again, what is P1 star P2 U2? Which one is it? This one, right? Because this is the new price, a higher P1. So with P1 star P2 U1, this is P1 star P2 U1. This is P1 star P2 U2. And what about this? P1 P2 U2. This is P1 P2 U1. And this would be P1 P2 U2. See that? P1 P2 U1, P1 P2 U2. So we actually have two ways to measure this. But the value of these two differences would not be the same. So we need to decide to use the original prices or the new prices. Once we decide to use P1, P2, then we measure the difference using P1, P2, U2 minus P1, P2, U1. If we choose the environment to be P1 star P2, so we use P1 star P2 U2 minus P1 star P2 U1. So you need to decide which environment you are using, be it this one or this one. Alright, once again, our purpose is to measure the difference in utility. However, we don't know the utility value. So we need to find some way to replace or to complement. Something we need, not to complement, to implement. We need to implement the measure, but we just cannot use this one directly. So we replace another one using the expenditure function. So if we want to measure the difference between U1, U2, we just use the difference between the expenditure. Okay? It's a substitution way to do this. But you may use the yellow MRT or the red MRT. You just need to decide which one to use. If you decide to use this one, just like you use P1 star P2, P1 star P2, P1 star P2. So they must be consistent. They must be consistent. So when we want to measure the difference between U2 and U1, we utilize expenditure under this price circumstance to measure U2 minus under this to measure U1. Or we may choose the environment using the initial price. So we use P1, P2 to measure U2 and P1, P2 to measure P1. Okay? So expenditure function is something we may implement. We may practically use that to find a monetary value, how much money you need. If you want to achieve this utility level, under these circumstances, this is your minimum expenditure, right? So how much money you need under these circumstances to achieve this level? It is another way to measure utility. So the new utility minus the old utility, if it is positive, which means you are better off. If the difference is negative, which means you are worse off. Okay? So either in this way, the new environment P1 star P2 and U2 expenditure P1 star P2 U2 minus P1 star P2 U1. Of course, the difference here will be negative, right? Which means the rising price makes you worse off. And if we measure the utility difference using the expenditure function with P1, P2, the initial relative price. So P1, P2, there is a let me denote this. Let me say something. Say it's A, B, and C, and D. Okay? So it's A, and B, and C, and D. Is that clear? You may compare A, B. you may compare CD. So either way tells us that we are worse off because of the increase in P1. But you see, B and C are actually the same, right? B and C are actually the same. So, if it is possible, I want you to change or to do some notes in somewhere, in some space, that this is one way and this is another way. To measure in red or to measure in yellow. All right, any question here? Okay, let's have a look at this one. Compensating variation, CV, compensating. So CV is the amount of money we would have to give a consumer after a price increase to keep the consumer on their original indifference curve. Okay, so the original budget line, the new budget line, and we need to compensate because after the price change, the consumer will be worse off, and we need to compensate this amount of money. So on the diagram of on the slide, there is an assumption, which is P2. If P2 is set to 1, then the vertical difference initially is the difference in Q2, right? However, if the unit price is 1, then the difference in quantity is actually the difference in money, right? In expenditure. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. I just told you the difference Q2 prime minus Q2 times P2 is the difference in expenditure, right? Because, once again, because the vertical intercept, what do you think about the vertical intercept? We may interpret the vertical intercept as follows. If we spend all money on good 2, how much or how many units may we have? How many Q2 can we have? So the vertical intercept is actually the amount if we spend all money on good 2. But now, if P2 is set to 1, if the price of quantity or if the price of commodity 2 is set to 1, so if I have $300 and P2 is 1, then how many Q2 can I have? $300, 300 units, right? So if the price is 1, then the quantity is actually the expenditure. Get it? Understand? So the vertical difference on Q2 or on the vertical difference on the vertical axis is actually the difference in expenditure if we set P2 to be 1. Okay? So this would be Y, and this would be Y plus CV. CV, compensating variation, is something we need to compensate the consumer so that the consumer may reach to the original utility level. Okay? So CV use the new price environment to measure. CV is something this. So this would be CV. And what is EV? EV is the amount of money, the expenditure, we would have to take away from a consumer to harm the consumer as much as the price increase did. What does it mean? Okay, this is the initial budget line, and with the initial or with the original price environment, we may measure the difference here, right? So EV is something we need to subtract from, we need to take away from the consumer so that he or she would feel the same as the price change. Because after the price change, his utility level reduced from this one to this one. Okay? So we use the original price to measure this. And we call this EV. So back to here, this difference is CV. And this difference is EV. Either